That morning at Naval Base San Diego, the thing about to be stopped was not an intruder coming through the gate. It was an American sailor walking in like any other day. The loudspeakers were routine. The checkpoints were routine. Cars rolled forward, boots hit pavement. Sailors moved with the same practiced rhythm that keeps a military base alive before most of the country is fully awake. Nothing looked wrong. And that is exactly what makes insider betrayal more frightening than any outsider. It does not crash through the fence. It already knows the fence. It wears the badge. It understands the rhythm. It disappears inside the ordinary. A man walks toward the USS Essex. Freeze that image. Because federal prosecutors say the sailor in that frame was Jinchao Wei, a machinist's mate assigned to the amphibious assault ship, a man trusted with access to sensitive information inside one of America's warships. And on that morning in August 2023, according to the Department of Justice, he was arrested as he arrived for work at Naval Base San Diego. No alarms for the public. No cinematic chaos. No screaming crowd. Just a quiet, cold shift in reality. In a matter of seconds, a normal workday turned into a counterintelligence takedown. Later, prosecutors would accuse Wei of doing something almost impossible to see from the outside, selling national defense information to an intelligence officer working for the People's Republic of China. Years later, a federal jury would convict him, and the case would become one more warning that some of the most dangerous breaches in national security do not begin with hackers or saboteurs. They begin with someone already inside the system. And that is what makes this story so unsettling. Because the question is not just what he sold. The real question is how someone so unremarkable, so routine, so perfectly blended into the machinery of the U.S. military could punch a hole straight through one of the most guarded systems in the world. To understand why this case mattered, you have to look at what Patrick Wei was not. He was not an admiral. He was not a fleet commander. He was not some legendary master spy hiding inside the Pentagon. He was a machinist's mate on the USS Essex, an active-duty sailor with a security clearance and access to sensitive information tied to the ship's weapons, propulsion, and desalination systems. In other words, he stood close to the machinery that keeps a warship alive, moving armed and deployable. And that is where this story turns dangerous. Because in modern military competition, an adversary does not need every secret. It only needs the right fragments. A technical manual, a systems description, a pattern of maintenance, a glimpse of defensive capabilities. Enough pieces placed in the right order can reveal far more than they seem to reveal alone. Prosecutors said Wei had access to exactly that kind of information, and that the USS Essex itself was no ordinary vessel. Amphibious assault ships like Essex function as platforms for American power projection, central to expeditionary and amphibious operations. That is what makes the phrase low-ranking sailor so misleading. The danger was not his title. The danger was his position inside the machine. A man does not need to command the ship to damage the ship. He only needs to be close enough to see what should never leave it. Close enough to understand what works, what breaks, what protects it, and what might expose it. Federal prosecutors later argued that Wei's access allowed him to pass along information that could help a foreign intelligence service build a sharper picture of U.S. naval capabilities and vulnerabilities. In counterintelligence, small does not mean harmless. Sometimes the smallest link is the one that snaps first. And by early 2022, someone on the other side had already begun pulling on it. If this story had started with a dark alley meeting or a coded exchange in some foreign capital, it would feel almost familiar. It did not. According to evidence presented by the Justice Department, the approach began on February 14, 2022 through social media. The man on the other end did not announce himself as an intelligence officer. He introduced himself as a naval enthusiast connected to China Shipbuilding Industry Corporation. It looked casual, curious, even flattering, the kind of message a careless person might answer without thinking. But this is where the case takes its sharpest turn. Prosecutor said Wei began to suspect very early that this was not innocent contact at all. 8 days later, he said the quiet part out loud. On February 22, 2022, Wei told a fellow sailor he believed he was on the radar of a Chinese intelligence organization. He described the contact as extremely suspicious, said the man wanted daily information about which ships were docked, and admitted he understood exactly what that meant. His friend told him to cut it off, delete the contact, end it there. That should have been the exit ramp. Instead, the next day, Wei moved the conversation to a different encrypted messaging app that he believed was safer, and prosecutors say that is when suspicion hardened into espionage. From there, the betrayal did not arrive in one dramatic theft. It came in layers. First photographs and videos of the USS Essex, then the locations of Navy ships, then descriptions of the ship's defensive weapons, then something even more valuable to a hostile intelligence service: weaknesses, problems aboard Essex, problems on other ships, the kind of details that do not just describe a fleet but expose where pressure might break it. And then came the deeper extraction: thousands of pages of technical and operational information taken from restricted Navy computer systems, including manuals detailing power, steering, weapons control elevators, and damage control systems. And for all of that, the payment was not some movie-sized fortune. It was more than $12,000 over 18 months. That is what makes the case feel so cold. Not because the operation was flashy, but because it was not. America's naval secrets were not stolen in a spectacular raid. They were pulled out piece by piece by a man already wearing the uniform. And by the summer of 2023, that slow leak was about to hit a wall. Now go back to that morning. The base is awake. Traffic is moving. The routines are doing what routines do best, making everything feel safe. Patrick Wei is heading to work toward the very ship where he had served the very system he had already been accused of quietly bleeding from within. Then the day breaks open. According to the Justice Department, Wei was arrested in August 2023 as he arrived for work at Naval Base San Diego home port of the Pacific Fleet, where the USS Essex was stationed. No cinematic chase, no public spectacle. Just the sudden controlled force of counterintelligence, catching up to a man who had hidden inside normalcy for far too long. In a few silent seconds, a sailor on his way to duty became the target of a federal espionage case. You can almost feel the coldness of it. Boots on pavement, the outline of the ship in the background, a hand on a bag strap, a few figures moving in with purpose. No wasted motion, no shouting for the cameras. Just the clean, clinical moment when routine ends and the mask comes off. Then the legal machine starts moving. Federal prosecutors said Wei had conspired to send national defense information to an intelligence officer working for the People's Republic of China and had also violated export control laws by transmitting restricted technical data. The indictment laid out the case in stark terms. This was not carelessness, not bad judgment, not a gray zone mistake. This was espionage. 2 years later, after a 5-day trial and 1 day of deliberation, a federal jury convicted him on 6 counts, including conspiracy to commit espionage, and export violations related to defense articles and technical data. And from that moment on, Patrick Wei was no longer just a sailor walking toward the USS Essex. He became something far more unsettling. Proof that the most dangerous threat is not always the one trying to break into the perimeter. Sometimes, it is the one that has been standing inside it the entire time. In January 2026, the sentence came down 200 months in federal prison. That number tells you how the United States viewed this case. Not as a lapse, not as a side story, not as one compromised sailor drifting into bad decisions. Prosecutors framed it as a direct wound to national security, and after Wei's conviction on 6 counts, the punishment made clear that the government saw the damage as far bigger than the man at the center of it. Because the real danger was never just the files themselves. It was what those files could teach an adversary. How an American warship functions under pressure. Which systems matter most. Which defensive features protect it. Where operational weaknesses might appear. How technical details, ship locations, manuals, and restricted data can be layered together until they stop looking like fragments and start looking like a map. A map of capability. A map of vulnerability. A map an intelligence service could study long before a crisis ever begins. And that is the darkest twist in the entire story. Patrick Wei was not frightening because he was extraordinary. He was frightening because he was ordinary. He did not need to be a genius operative. He did not need a glamorous cover. He did not need millions of dollars. According to the Justice Department, more than $12,000 over roughly 18 months was enough to keep the information flowing. That is what makes modern counterintelligence so uncomfortable. The threat does not always arrive wearing a stranger's face. Sometimes it starts with a social media message. Sometimes it grows through small compromises. Sometimes betrayal is cheap. And that leaves behind the question bigger than Wei himself. Why are young service members so vulnerable to online targeting? Why does digital contact work so well? Why can relatively small payments still buy catastrophic access? Why does catching espionage now mean not only watching outsiders, but noticing subtle changes in people already trusted? Because in the end, the enemy does not always need to sneak someone into the base. Sometimes, all they have to do is find the right person who is already inside.